Ever notice how ads always pop up at the worst moments? When the killer's identity is about to be revealed. During that perfect meditation flow. On Amazon Music, we believe in keeping you in the moment. That's why we've got millions of ad-free podcast episodes, so you can stay completely immersed in every story, every reveal, every breath. Download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite podcasts ad-free, included with Prime.
So today we're taking a really serious look at the global economy. There's been a lot of noise. Maybe you've seen the headlines. We're going to dig into warnings from two very significant figures, Ray Dalio and Jerome Powell.
Right. Both have a deep history in navigating economic shifts, and their recent statements, well, they point towards some pretty major systemic risks.
Risks that could really affect all of us. Our goal here is to understand exactly what they're worried about, drawing straight from what they've said recently.
And it's interesting, or maybe worrying, how their concerns seem to be aligning, even if they're coming at it from slightly different perspectives. We need to get to the core of it.
Okay, let's start with Ray Dalio. He was on Meet the Press Sunday, April 13th, just a few days ago. And he said something quite stark, worrying about something potentially worse than a recession.
And the core of that, for you listening, is his concern about a potential breakdown, a fundamental breakdown, of the global monetary system itself.
That sounds incredibly serious.
It is. Dalio's looking at decades of cycles, geopolitics. He seems to be tying a lot of this current unease to President Trump's policies, especially tariffs. He argues they're directly threatening the global economic order we've known for a long time, and that inevitably impacts your financial situation.
He was very direct about it on the show. He said, and this quote really stands out, needs to be understood.
Yeah.
Right now, we are at a decision-making point and very close to a recession.
Yes, but then the kicker.
And I'm worried about something worse than a recession if this isn't handled well.
Yeah.
That something worse is what we really need to explore for you today.
Exactly. And Dalio provides a framework for thinking about this. He talks about moving away from a multilateral, sort of U.S.-led, cooperative world towards a more unilateral world order, more fragmented, more conflict-prone. And for you, that likely means more economic uncertainty, more volatility.
And he sees the tariffs, or specifically how they're being applied, as a big driver of this instability.
That's right. He has those 5 forces. He always talks about economy, internal politics, international order, tech, nature. He seems to suggest that while the goals behind the tariffs might be understandable to some, the way they're being implemented is just too disruptive for the global system, which affects everyone.
So what's his proposed solution or path forward?
Well, on X Wednesday, he talked about needing a win-win trade deal with China, suggested something about currency value adjustments. But crucially, for both the U.S. and China, and this impacts the whole global system you rely on, he stressed they both need to tackle their massive debts.
Okay, let's zero in on that U.S. federal debt issue. Dalio's been quite vocal about this, hasn't he?
Oh, definitely. He mentioned needing to get the deficit down to 3% of GDP back at that CNBC event in March, and repeated it on Meet the Press.
And his warning is specific. Fail to do that, and you create a, what do you call it, a supply-demand problem for debt.
Exactly. A supply-demand problem for debt happening at the same time as other major stressors. He thinks the outcome could be much, much worse than a standard recession for you and the economy generally.
Can you break that down a bit? What does that supply-demand problem mean, practically?
Well, if the U.S. keeps issuing huge amounts of debt, but there aren't enough buyers globally, or they demand much higher interest rates, then borrowing costs shoot up for the government, obviously, but also for, you think, mortgages, car loans, credit cards, plus it squeezes government spending on other things. That's why it's more than just a normal downturn risk.
Which leads Dalio to this incredibly stark conclusion.
Yeah.
The very value of money is at stake.
Yes. He's sketching a scenario where the bond market potentially breaks down, maybe combined with political conflict, internal or external. And he thinks that shock could be bigger, more damaging than, say, Nixon taking the U.S. off gold in '71 or even the 2008 crisis.
Wow. So for anyone listening, that points to potential instability at the very foundation of your savings, your investments, everything.
It really does. He's stressing the interconnectedness. It's not just tariffs or just debt. It's how they combine to potentially shake confidence in U.S. assets, in the dollar itself. And that has massive global knock-on effects for trade, for the value of your assets.
But he does offer some hope, right? He says this isn't inevitable.
He does. He emphasizes that. He believes it's avoidable if policymakers act decisively on the deficit. And importantly, if the U.S. works to calm global tensions and promotes, more efficient, less disruptive policies internationally, actions that would ultimately help stabilize things for everyone.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly now to Jerome Powell, the Fed chair. His warnings carry a similar weight, even if the focus is a bit different.
Right. Speaking at the Economic Club of Chicago, he flagged something quite specific about the current trade policies. The key takeaway for you here is that the head of the central bank is expressing deep unease.
He said there's no modern experience to guide how to respond to this kind of trade war initiated by President Trump.
Exactly. And he didn't just call it bad policy. He framed it as a potential unprecedented economic and constitutional crisis.
That's incredibly strong language. Constitutional crisis. That really highlights how serious he views the threat to our systems, economic and political, which, of course, impacts you directly.
Yeah, and Powell seems really focused on the process, or maybe the lack thereof, the erosion of institutional norms. He sees this push to reshape the economy mainly through executive action, kind of bypassing Congress, bypassing established trade law.
And crucially, the attempts to influence the Fed itself.
That's a huge red flag for him. The Fed's independence is paramount for economic stability, for your stability.
Let's look at the scale of these tariffs mentioned. Oregon's Bay Area listed them out. Potentially 145% on Chinese goods, 25% on Mexico and Canada outside the agreement.
Plus potential tariffs looming on semiconductors, timber, pharma, and that baseline 10% on basically all imports.
They call these tectonic shifts, done with minimal legislative buy-in. For you, the listener, that surely means potential price hikes and supply chain chaos, right?
Absolutely. It creates enormous uncertainty. Businesses, investors, they need some level of predictability. These kinds of sweeping, rapid changes done largely outside the normal legislative process, it chills investment, it can hurt job creation, and ultimately hits your wallet.
And Powell specifically warned about stagflation.
Yes. That nasty mix of slow growth, rising prices, and rising unemployment. He directly linked it to the potential fallout from the tariffs.
He drew a parallel with Paul Volcker fighting inflation years ago.
But with a crucial difference. He pointed out Volcker didn't also have a president actively trying to undermine the Fed while he was doing it. For you, stagflation is a double whammy. Your money buys less, and your job might feel less secure.
That point about Fed independence feels critical for your financial future.
It's absolutely fundamental. Powell knows the Fed can't manage inflation or stabilize the economy effectively if it's constantly under political pressure. Reports of trying to influence rate decisions, whether through public posts or allegedly trying to install loyalists, that directly threatens the stability the Fed is supposed to provide for your savings and the economy.
Oregon's Bay Area also pointed a finger at Congress, mentioning a refusal or inability to assert its role in trade policy.
Right. The argument being made is that the president is using sort of obscure emergency powers, old statutes, maybe exploiting a lack of congressional pushback to drive these big economic changes.
For you, the listener, that raises pretty big questions about checks and balances, doesn't it?
Right.
How economic policy gets made long term.
It really does. When one branch, especially the executive, gains that much concentrated power over economic levers, bypassing the usual legislative debate and oversight, it injects risk and unpredictability into the whole system you operate in.
And the potential endgame described is grim. A Fed potentially hamstrung, an economy in trouble, and maybe the president blaming disloyal bankers or globalist saboteurs.
It paints a picture of serious instability, both economic and political, which would have a direct negative impact on your financial security and the country's economic health overall.
Expanding out a bit, this analysis from Oregon's Bay Area also touches on the broader global picture, suggesting the whole post-war monetary order might be weakening.
Yeah, they noted how global leaders seem reluctant to really engage with President Trump, presented less as just diplomacy, more as a sign of deep unease about where U.S. economic policy is headed and what it means for the global economy you're part of.
And circling back to the U.S. debt, the sheer size of it is a major factor people need to grasp.
Definitely. Having to refinance something like $10 trillion in maturing debt just this year, and at these much higher interest rates, that puts huge pressure on the system.
The numbers are staggering. Annual interest payments potentially copy $1.2 trillion.
Yeah.
More than the entire defense budget.
That's the projection. And that money has to come from somewhere. It's a massive drag, diverting funds from other priorities that could benefit you, like infrastructure or research. It really fuels Dalio's warnings about financial brinkmanship. When he draws parallels to 1929, 1971, 2008, he's signaling this could be a far deeper crisis than we've seen recently, with potentially severe effects on your financial life.
And his ultimate fear, the dollar losing its role as the world's reserve currency. The implications are almost unthinkable.
Calling the U.S. potentially a banana republic with nukes. It's chilling language, meant to shock, but it underlines the severity of the risk he perceives.
Is there evidence others are getting nervous?
Well, the idea floated is that other countries, maybe Canada, the EU, Japan, might be quietly trimming their holdings of U.S. treasuries. Not necessarily hostilely, but just as prudent risk management. If they see instability coming, they might diversify, which of course could further pressure the U.S. system you rely on.
And the markets reacted badly to Powell's warnings.
Reportedly, yes. Plunging across the board was the description. It shows how sensitive markets are to these high-level concerns, meaning more potential volatility for your investments.
And the potential fallout listed soaring prices, broken supply chains, job losses, paints a very difficult picture for everyday people.
It does. And then you add in concerns raised by Senator Warren about potential market manipulation, suspicious trades, even the alleged weaponization of economic data.
What does that mean, weaponizing data?
The allegation involves things like firing economists who produce inconvenient numbers, maybe suppressing statistics, replacing solid projections with vibes. It damages trust in the very information we all need, including you, to make sound financial decisions.
Even something like the housing market seems to be feeling the strain, which affects so many people, homeowners and renters alike.
Right. Fewer people at open houses, mortgage rates climbing back up near 6.6% and rising, builders cutting prices even though their own costs are up. It all points to a major affordability crunch.
So wrapping it all together, it feels like a core issue is this erosion of trust in U.S. economic management, trust in the data, trust in institutions, both domestically and globally.
I think that's a key takeaway. If global allies start planning for a U.S. downturn purely out of self-preservation, the geopolitical shifts, the economic consequences, they could be really profound and last a long time, affecting trade, stability, everything that shapes your economic environment.
So listening to both Dalio and Powell, the message is undeniably serious. We're not just talking about a normal cyclical recession here.
No. The potential confluence of factors, trade wars, massive debt, questions about institutional independence, a shifting global order points to something potentially much more disruptive. For you, it really highlights why paying attention to these complex issues is so important right now.
And the interconnectedness is key, isn't it? You can't really isolate these issues.
Exactly. Trade policy impacts debt. Debt levels impact the Fed's options. Domestic choices ripple outwards globally, affecting the whole financial system that ultimately supports global commerce and your own financial security.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, and it has been a sobering one, maybe the final thought for you, our listener, is this. What happens if these warnings from people with decades of experience navigating these systems aren't sufficiently heeded? What are the long-term consequences for global financial stability, and ultimately for your own economic future if these trends continue unchecked?